pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. Like you said, my name is Eric Flory. I'm the agency licensing coordinator with the state of Michigan, which kind of means I do all the licensing and paperwork and just licensing really for the ambulances and ambulance services here in Michigan. Before that, I worked the road as a paramedic and as an IC for many years. I really haven't pulled a shift since COVID, and at this point, I'm not sure anybody wants to be working on them. So I have more time to kind of do things like this. So thanks again. So yes, history of EMS from ancient times up until 1914. When I first started thinking about trying to put this presentation together, it's kind of difficult to figure out where to start. You want to keep going further and further back. You're trying to nail down, what's a good point to start the story of EMS. And I just kind of kept going backwards. And so we'll start the journey here. Some objectives for this. I'm trying to make sure everybody gains context where EMS fits into the world, gain historical insight to realize where EMS is going in the future, gain appreciation and self-worth with the help of tradition, and use this knowledge to further advocate EMS to the public. So I realize this presentation may not help providers in the field with physical skills, but I do think it's important that we realize where we are as a profession and where we came from. It's real hard to know our place in the world without proper context. So we can move forward. So we can look backwards to go forward. So, and one other disclaimer: I am not a historian. I like reading books and doing some own research. And while doing that, I just thought this would be really, really important and cool to share with everybody. So it's quite possible there's references and other firsthand accounts that have been lost to time or that I'm not aware of, or that, there's historical events in places where there's no records, or they just haven't been translated. The story of the ambulance is unknown in places like China, Africa, or Japan. Maybe someday there'll be material translated from a different language and we'll be able to incorporate that in there. If anyone has any input from different resources, I'd be happy to hear about them. And if you could forward them to me, I'd really appreciate it. So how did we get to where we are today? For all of EMS's problems and kind of shortfalls there are, it's truly wonderful and unique that anyone can pick up the phone and call for help. With almost certainty, someone's going to respond. Looking back at all the suffering in the world and in history, it's only been very recently have we been able to do something consistently responding. In the past, whether it was on the battlefield or in crowded cities, there was no guarantee somebody would come and help you. So why did it take so long to put into place an organized system of helping people? That's kind of the question we're going to try and answer today. There's a few books that I use primarily for a lot of the research or a lot of the reference or starting points, at least. This first one is just titled The Ambulance. It was printed in 1978, reprinted in 1990. Pretty thin book, just kind of a general overview. Not a whole lot of detail, but for at the time, I'm glad it came out when it did. The second book is called Bellevue, 3 Centuries of Medicine and Mayhem at America's Most Storied Hospital. There's only one chapter really that delves into the ambulance and EMS response, but it's a real fascinating read. There's a lot of really interesting stories about America's probably most famous and notorious hospital. So that's a very interesting book. The third one, it's called A History of the Ambulance. If I was going to suggest one book, this would probably be it. As I quote things through the presentation, a lot of it's taken from this book. It has a really good overview from ancient times up until the modern. So this is a really great resource. Before we start getting into the actual events and in places, I would like to just kind of take a look at the Star of Life for a second, just because of the symbolism in it. So the Red Cross symbol cannot be used. So the chief of the EMS branch of NHTSA took the red medical identification symbol of the American Medical Association, changed it to blue, placed it on a white square to give our profession some kind of logo. This is a registered trademark held by NHTSA, but I think it's primarily used on their triple K certification, Star of Ambulances. But to my knowledge, they do not enforce this copyright, which is good. It gives EMS a unique symbol, a logo. When people see it, they know exactly what it is. I think we're very fortunate to have such a symbol. It's very unique, not only in the medical field, but in the public service world. It distinguishes us from other professions. It's very important to have a clear defined symbol, whether it's, for Coca-Cola or the Avengers or whatever it is. It's something that separates us and separates us and gives us identity as opposed to other people out there. And I think I remember reading once upon a time in my EMT basic book, the 6 points, representing different things: detection, reporting, response, on-scene care, care in transit, transfer to definitive care. And then you have the medicine and healing staff in the center. So where did this symbol come from? The staff with a snake. It's an ancient symbol. Its origins can be found going back to the Bible and ancient Greece. It's long been associated with miracles and healing. The symbol still kind of remains in our collective consciousness as a sign of healing, kind of a remnant from earlier times. The ancient Greek god Asclepios was the son of Apollo and was the god of healing. On his staff was a snake. Temples were built for his worship and maintained a cult following. Why the exact reason for the snake has been embraced as a symbol of healing is up to speculation. Could be of the shedding of skin, possibly a sign of rejuvenation, or the overcoming of dangerous struggles of life. It's like I said, it's kind of up to speculation though. The caduceus does not equal the staff of Asclepios. The caduceus was another ancient symbol for the Greek god Hermes. It's used as a medical symbol, began in the late 19th century as a result of confusion and mistaken identity. From what I can tell, it was used by a doctor and he put it in one of his books, and from there it kind of took off as a symbol of medicine. So traditionally not a medical symbol, but at this point it is recognized as one. So how did ancient people get moved? It's up to speculation and our imagination. There are no records of how people were moved 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. We simply do not know. We can assume that a lot of it was human ingenuity. If there was no official system in place of where you were probably left to the mercy of those around you, for people to push, pull, or drag to someone who could help you, or at least make you feel comfortable. The Edward Smith Papyrus, written in 1500 BC, describes triage and treatment protocols. And this Babylonian code of Hammurabi is reference to emergency care and protocols for treatment of the injured. It's one of the few ancient writings that exists, but unfortunately there's not much details. This could be because of writing styles or just how valuable paper and tablets were at the time. It was a very valuable resource. You wouldn't want to put a lot of extra fluff on there with the limited space. Each line was very precious. It was a very valuable commodity. There'd also be no reason to put in things that were considered common knowledge or self-evident. If everyone knew how to move wounded people, there would be no reason to document it. Kind of think of a description of someone driving to the store. The written description probably would not go into every detail how you got into the car and how to operate it, things like that. It's assumptions people would know. The Romans were the first army in the world to use dedicated trained medical personnel to care for their wounded. The Roman legions had their own physicians. Each doctor had a specific specialty and also had assistants at his disposal, a nurse or an orderly. By the time of Marcus Aurelius around 170 AD, the military medical service had adopted as its symbol the staff of Asclepios as its mark. The duties of Roman military doctors included the examination of selection of recruits, treatment of the sick, and care of the wounded. This included the controlling of hemorrhages, amputation of limbs, ligation of vessels, and the reduction and dressing of fractures or dislocations. Wounded soldiers were transported from the battlefield to ancient medical centers. Also, probably slaves were used extensively to do this. Slaves weren't able to serve in the military and fight, so they were primarily delegated to logistic backups, moving things. So it makes sense that they would help with the physicians and the management of wounded and the dead. So all this is said, but it's not exactly clear how they accomplished or the specifics of this. I can't find any firsthand accounts, only generalized statements of this. The Byzantine Empire was the first documented case of dedicated troops to move wounded soldiers. The Strategicon was developed by the Byzantiums that was sort of like a warrior's encyclopedia. It's very, very meticulous and basically a who's who of the world and their fighting styles and characteristics. The Eastern Roman Empire was extremely successful and organized. References to the many types of cavalry are listed, including medical corpsmen who would use the stirrups to pick up wounded men or carry water. Riders would receive 1 gold coin for each man they saved. So this is the first documented account of dedicated people in battle whose specific job was to move people, the wounded, to a place of care. The next documented case of people actually specifically going and helping and bringing people back and helping them are the Brothers of Mercy, which began civilian transports sometime around 1240 in Florence, Italy. At the time, Florence was a very well-off city because of trades. This began with porters who were laborers that would move textiles, and in their downtime, they were very famous for indulging in wine and having good conversation. So somebody came up with the idea of providing charity work. So it started out as a swear jar that soon filled, and they would use this as charity money and to help out. These pious acts were encouraged by the church and local officials. It was at a time, as the time went by, they acquired equipment and property such as sedan chairs. They helped out greatly during the plague of the 1300s. They maintained a pauper cemetery. They would be summoned by the town bell. So one peal the bell for common illness or injury, 2 for serious accident, and 3 would proclaim death, and the litter was needed as a hearse. They would conceal their charitable actions as not to be contaminated by the sin of pride. That's why they have the masks donned over their faces and doing it, confidentially. So all these pictures are from the 1800s, and they were still operational into the 1900s when they became more of a tourist attraction. Kind of think of the gondoliers of Venice. They may not be practical, but it is tradition. The last reference I can find of them was that of a few years ago when the city required them to start wearing reflective stripes in the black robes for safety. So I assume they're still operating at some capacity. It would be interesting to know what they did during COVID or if how that looks afterwards. So we're moving quite along here. So into the 1400s, we come to the Queen of Castile. She was a major world figure. She unified Spain with her husband, King Ferdinand, helped with the regulation of crime through enforcement of law, took over the production of money and unburdened the kingdom of enormous debt. She established the Spanish Inquisition, financed Christopher Columbus's 1492 voyage, and unified Spain by defeating the Moors. I bring up all these things to emphasize that she was a major force. She had many revolutionary ideas and was a major world player at the time. So she developed the first, what she called ambulancias in the war to unify Spain with the Moors, which was recorded in 1477. So they actually had dedicated wagons that would transport wounded patients to a field hospital. On into the 1600s, the ideas from the Queen of Castile kind of spread around Europe during warfare. They're still using crude wagons with benches. There's no innovations. During war, wounded soldiers would be delivered to the Drekapatika. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it translates into filth pharmacy. So there, people would be offered such treatments as dog fat, scorpion oil, and mummy dust, camphor, and opium. So imagine going into battle back then, becoming wounded and laying there for days. If you somehow did survive your wounds and exposure, you had to hope that somehow your side won and they would find you in the aftermath of battle and survive. If your side did not win, they would probably just kill you and move on. At that time, hospitals in London were more concerned about discharging patients rather than arrivals. There's no organized resources to help people to get to the hospital. In 1644, charity hospitals would provide, quote, money and other necessities. This was given to, quote, naked and miserable poor. In 1665, London hospitals hired a sedan chairs to help victims to the hospitals or to their home or to quarantine. So now we're reached Dominique Larry in the flying ambulance. So this is the first time you find something that would fit the true definition kind of a modern ambulance. He is quite the historical figure, became assistant surgeon in the French army in 1792, spent 18 years with Napoleon, accompanying him with 25 campaigns and 400 engagements, created extraordinary battlefield journals. He documented tetanus, the pathology of cold injuries, hemorrhage control, drainage of hemothorax, aspiration of pericardial infusion, and the packing of sucking chest wounds. He also created triage. So if you ever wondered why we use triage, which is a French word, it's from Dominique Larry. So he's a major player in medical advancements, not just the ambulance. He's an advocate of early amputations. This kind of shows an amputation that he invented or is known for and is actually named after him. So it was reportedly that he performed 200 amputations in 24 hours at one battle, averaging one amputation every 7 to 8 minutes. So which kind of lines up with the fact he could complete an amputation in about 4 to 5 minutes. At the Battle of Waterloo, he was injured and captured and was sentenced to death, but he was recognized by a German physician who had been attending his lectures. When he was brought before him, he immediately pardoned him because he had previously saved the life of this general's son. So his practice of treating the wounded on opposing sides actually saved his life at one point. And he remained in military service until the end of until his death at the age of 76. So one of the reasons the French military and Napoleon was so good at fighting is they had great cavalry. And what you see here is what they would call flying artillery. So they'd have horses hooked up to these small wagons with cannons, and they could move around them very fast. That's why they call them flying artillery. So what Dominique Larry thought was, why, if we can do that with guns, why can't we do it with a stretcher, basically, or a box to put people in? So, and this really revolutionized how quick it was. This was specifically designed to put patients in and to move them quickly from the battlefield. So what seems like common sense at that time was very revolutionary. Up until that point, military resources would go into fighting. You know, if you'd want to put all your wagons, all your horses, all your men trying to fight the other people. And Dominique Larry saw the advantages of taking care of his people, and how if he could move them quick and get them quick amputations, that the expectancy of their life would greatly improve. So why the slow adoption of ambulances by civilians? Civilian ambulances were slow to be adopted in Europe. Historically, hospitals were provided and managed by the church. There was no standardization by the government, discrepancies from city to city. A lot of times hand carts, long pole stretchers, or anything else could be used by civilians to try to move people the best they could. So this is just a kind of a picture of London from a newspaper in that time. So, cholera was a major issue. Trash was everywhere in the streets. There's a swelling population moving into the city for jobs. There's just various slums all over the city, cramped buildings, small rooms of no running water or in or out of the buildings. Urine and feces were thrown out the window into the gutters. Neighborhoods would have a shared well pump for everyone. This included animal filth from horses, pigs, etc. There's also an increased amount of traumatic injuries with the coming Industrial Revolution. So really you have just a condensed population for the first time coming together, living on top of each other. I mean, just from this picture, you can see, there's a heap of trash. There's some kids playing in it. There's an old lady looking for something to eat out of it. Some kids playing with a rat. Some children just kind of wallowing in the filth. So put that on top of this new industrial revolution where people are working with machines and there's coal and there's steam. So there's a lot more traumatic injuries happening in these condensed areas. And also cholera. So cholera was a huge problem. There's many outbreaks. If you're not familiar with cholera, somebody can wake up and look fine, and become symptomatic extremely fast, and become dehydrated in a matter of hours from vomiting and diarrhea, and die. This can spread very fast. So cholera outbreaks were truly terrifying experiences for these cities. So on to the Crimean War. So this is where ambulances kind of take a world stage. So other people are going to start recognizing the value in these ambulances. So Crimean War, it was fought between England, France, and the Turkish Empire versus Russia, right around the Black Sea. You can see the Ukraine. It seems to be one of those places in the world where there's always conflict. So with England and France on the same side, England was slow to adopt the French's enthusiasm for the ambulance. The Crimean War was the first time a war was reported in real time, thanks to the telegraph. So up until that point, news traveled really slow. It'd take days, or weeks, really, especially trying to go across different countries and hundreds, thousands of miles. But because of telegraphs, reporters there were able to report back, that same day, what was happening in the battle and really describe what's going on. So reporters were documenting the extreme differences between the French flying ambulances and the British effort, which was basically nothing. So you can kind of think from a morale standpoint, the difference. If you're fighting for an army who has ambulances that will come save you if you're wounded, maybe you're a little more enthusiastic to go out there and fight than instead of just laying around on the battlefield waiting to die. So public support in Britain started enthusiastically for the war, but it changed during the reporting. There were just major logistical failures all around, not just with the ambulances and health, but other supply trains. Failure for the British to properly care for the wounded became a scandal. So Florence Nightingale would change the way military hospitals cared for the wounded through basic sanitary methods. So she's a pretty famous person. You probably heard of her. But the British sent her over there to kind of as a PR thing and to kind of clean up the hospitals because they were so gross. So she would later write a book on the experience and revolutionize nursing all over the world. So she's doing for hospitals what we'll see the Civil War do for ambulances. At the time, a U.S. major was there to send to observe, and he would remark that the want of ambulances. He would later be the first U.S. officer to command the ambulances. And so during this time, the ambulances in London start making their first appearance. There's only a few hospitals that begin using horses and coaches. There begins to be a public outcry from editorials in the newspapers. And at that point, they're beginning to be manufactured. So the first ones were basically closed grained leather, wood enameled with thick coat of paint. Pillow and mattresses were fashioned out of vulcanized rubber. There was a room for an attendant in the patient compartment. They were purposely made not to look like a hearse because nobody wants to go for a ride in a hearse. Any person could apply to use them as long as they were willing to pay for the horse time. So this brings us to the Civil War. I'm not going to scare you with my singing voice, but this was printed in Vanity Fair. Let the broad column of men advance. We follow behind with the ambulance. Through the rattling bullets and clashing steel, we steadily guide the leaping wheel. Writhing in agony they lie, cursing the ambulance, praying to die, while some in a dreamy death-like trance bleed life away through the ambulance. So with press like that, who in their right mind would want to get in an ambulance? At the beginning of the war, the wagons were crude benches. It's reported that the wounded would sometimes scream to be left on the side of the road instead of continuing their journey. Think about how uncomfortable modern patients can be with meds on board and on a padded stretcher. Now imagine people with horrific war wounds bouncing down the road. Or it's not even a road, maybe it's just a gutted trail or a field or something like that. In the lead up to the war, it was thought that the ambulance corps would just impede the progress of troops and supply trains and would be prohibitively expensive. They would just clutter up the battlefield with non-combatants and just basically get in the way, which was the prevailing thought all through history, really. Any resources you might have should be used to fight, not to help the wounded. At the beginning of the Civil War, there was 40 ambulances for every 10,000 troops. There was poor construction. but with some ingenuity, such as trap doors that they could use to, let some of the fluids out from the wagon or the floor of the ambulance. These people who were driving the ambulance were volunteers and were considered unfit for service. So this included the elderly, injured, alcoholics, or insubordinates. There's a quote there by Dr. Letterman: driven by civilian drunkards and thieves who ran when they heard the guns. The ambulances that were available were sometimes used for other purposes. So even if it was an ambulance, it might be commandeered for some other military purpose. The Rucker ambulance would become the standard ambulance that would be built specifically during the war. So it's actually for the express purpose of moving patients. So you can see there's a couple different configurations. You could stack, so you have 4 of them in the back of the wagon, or you could set it up so people could just sit down in the seats. This is a picture of a refurbished one that is at the Civil War Museum, I believe. I think I have the next slide here. The National Museum of Civil War Medicine. Their website's pretty cool if you want to check that out sometime. So in their last time I looked, they were looking for donations to keep retrofitting and remodeling and upkeeping this thing. So if you're so inclined, you can go check that out. Here's another one. This is at a national park in Kansas. So you can see there the configuration. And here are a couple pictures from the actual Civil War. So if you look at this picture closely, these are actually African-American gentlemen that are driving the ambulance, I believe. So the other part of the ambulances during the Civil War is you need stretcher bearers. They would go into the battlefield carrying the stretcher and attempt to retrieve the wounded. The hope was that since they were non-combatants, that they would not get shot at. The wounded would then be put into ambulances and transported to a field hospital to be stabilized, which would include bleeding control and amputations. That's just a link, actually, to those pictures. They kind of have a 3D effect to them, but you don't have to check that out. This individual, Dr. Henry Ingersoll Bowditch, he was a character. Yeah, he helped bring ambulances into the war. He was an abolitionist, so much so that his biographies seldom mention his work on bringing the ambulances to the forefront. He helped form the Anti-Man Hunting League in Boston. The group trained to capture slave catchers and then planned to hold them for ransom in exchange for free runaway slaves. This plan was never put into action. But it was one time discovered a bounty jumper during an enlistment physical and inscribed the letter D for deserter in the flesh of the man's arm using a wand of silver nitrate. This man sued him for thousands of dollars and won. He is credited with popularizing the stethoscope. He volunteered as a military surgeon during the war and had many firsthand accounts. His son Nathaniel died from wounds in the war. And after that, it moved him so much that he authored this pamphlet called "I Breathe Plea, an Ambulance System." So after much lobbying and going around and trying to get support, in March of 1864, the Union had a uniform ambulance system as a result of him. That was the last year of the war. Just somebody that I found very interesting while doing some research, and specifically, I am from Michigan, so she is also from Michigan. So I thought this was very interesting. Her name was Anna Etheridge. She volunteered at the age of 21 with the Michigan Infantry Regiment. Her husband deserted, but she decided to stay. She was awarded a horse because of her bravery and wore sergeant stripes. She wore a long side saddle skirt with 2 pistols on her belt and stayed just behind the lines. When she saw a man fall, she dashed into the midst of the battle to lift the wounded soldier onto her horse and to get him to safety. Twice her horse was shot out from under her. Once the fighting had ended, she would scour the area to retrieve soldiers who had been left on the battlefield and bound the wounds of those who had not yet been seen by a surgeon, making them as comfortable as possible. She was at major battles such as Bull Run, Gettysburg, and many other battles. She earned the Kearney Cross, awarded to any Union officer who performed acts of extreme bravery and heroism in the face of the enemy. While she was not paid while in service, after the war, she received a job at the Treasury Office and eventually was paid $25 a month pension for her service. She is buried at the Arlington National Cemetery in 1913. Confederate ambulances during the war had the same problems as the North. There's no organized system. As the war continued, they had less and less resources as they started to lose the war. As ambulances approved in the Union, they regressed for the Confederacy. Not a lot of history or any kind of firsthand accounts or anything I can come up with. So it's kind of a guess as to what exactly was going on. Probably just doing with what they had and the best they could with limited resources. So during the war, casualties were transported to hospitals in the North. They'd use trains, riverboats, and ambulances to move the wounded to hospitals. These hospitals were getting paid to transport and treat the soldiers. When hospital contractors weren't able to keep up with the need for transports, the first civilian ambulance service was created in Philadelphia. This fire department, the Rescue 1 Squad, was called to action when the fire bell in Old Independence Hall rang 15 times. After the war, most of the ambulances were sold off because there was no system to support them. A few firefighter companies continued with this service. This is just Harper Woods Hospital in Detroit. There's a lot of history there. One of the hospitals that took patients in during the war. So the U.S. starts to take the lead in civilian ambulances in the world. Unlike in Europe, the U.S. has no standing army. Every soldier in the war was exposed to ambulances. So when they returned to their civilian lives, they took their experiences with them, and doctors and surgeons would return to the hospitals and begin setting up ambulance services. At the same time was the first Convention of Geneva, the Geneva Convention. So in the very first article actually references ambulances. This is ambulances and military hospitals should be recognized as neutral and as such protected and respected by the belligerents as long as they accommodate wounded and sick. Neutrality shall end if the said ambulances or hospitals should be held by a military force. So there's some recognition, at least even globally now, that ambulances are being used and they're being deployed, and there needs to be some kind of rules governing them, even on the battlefield. So this is Bellevue Hospital, New York. They were also one of the hospitals that would receive patients during the war. From this first picture, it looks like a very peaceful, idyllic hotel. But it was a public charitable hospital. It was home to psychiatric facilities, criminally ill, and an orphanage. They would receive patients that had nowhere else to go and no means to pay. There were other private hospitals, but they were a charity house themselves. It was located 2 miles on the East River from the center of New York. Because of the amount of critical patients, it was considered the best teaching hospital in the country. It was considered very prestigious. Dr. Edward Dalton left Bellevue in 1861 and served the Union. He'd return after the war and become the newly created sanitary superintendent of New York. So he was put in charge of sanitation and disease prevention. In May of 1866, cholera returned to New York. Dalton created a rapid response team. His time in the war would influence this creation. He was credited with significantly reducing the number of cholera cases because of the response teams. By May of 1867, the response crews were gone, and Mr. Dalton continued to advocate for a permanent ambulance service. In 1869, New York commissioners accepted a plan to install an ambulance service in the lower part of the city and Bellevue for the upper part of the city. This plan would include incorporating policemen or patrolmen, more or less, who already administered first aid and using station houses to telegraph for the ambulances. This had just been done the same way during the cholera response teams. Up until this time, police were kind of the do-it-all force of the city that did everything. So this plan called for surgeons, for ambulance surgeons. The plan from Bellevue in their training program. The offer for them was $50 per month with lodging and meals included. The schedule consisted of 12-hour shifts with 1 day off per month. This proved to be a hard sell for people and not sustainable. And they soon had to turn to physicians that were still in training. So they're trying to hire these graduated surgeons to do this job on the ambulance, and it's proving too tough and they can't pay them well enough. So they're now turning to trainers or people who are still in training to do that. Here's just a quote from the Times. After the initial rush of excitement had passed, the long hours and unpleasant working conditions made ambulance service unappealing to most established physicians. On the other hand, interns eager for experience and conditioned to expect meager reimbursement made ideal candidates for the ambulance duty. So, and at the time here, the surgeons were equipped with some of the following in the ambulance: a quart of flask of brandy, 2 tourniquets, splints, blankets for padding, buckled straps for immobilizing fractures, bandages, sponges, persulfate of iron used to astringe to stop bleeding, handcuffs, and a straitjacket. So, and at this time, there's really a poor relationship with the public and the press. Nobody's really seeing the value of these ambulances. These surgeons are operating completely on their own in the field. The insurance system helps subsidize these ambulances. A lot of their memoirs, they admit to relying heavily on the suggestions of their more experienced drivers. Yes, they are ambulance drivers. They have no training. Most of them were immigrants who saw the pay with room and board step up from common labor. They did have to know the geography of the city. They had to be very fast. The goal was to cover 1 mile in 5 to 8 minutes in the business district and 1 mile in 4 to 6 minutes in the crowded parts of the city. They would actually get together and compete and try to get the best times. And the ambulance itself had gold lettering, had a gas lantern and night reflectors, a foot pedal, which sounded a bell to warn pedestrians. And the ambulance had a right of way over all vehicles except the fire wagon and the U.S. mail. So I'm not sure why the mail was so important, but they had to yield to them. Hard Island. So many patients ended up at the morgue next door to the hospital. They went unclaimed, and unidentified bodies were put in windows for inspections by passersby. Those who remained anonymous until putrefaction set in were carried down the East River aboard the steamer MV Hope. The Hope ferried the unclaimed bodies to Hart Island, where they were piled, and the remains guarded from body snatchers and by feral mastiffs. So more than 1,000 burials are conducted each year still currently, and it's estimated that 1 million people are actually buried across the island's 100+ acres. The exact number is difficult to pin down. During the 30s, graves were reused after bodies had decomposed to skeletal remains. There's a fire in the 1970s which destroyed the records. In the 1980s, the first AIDS patients were buried there, and even recently, many COVID patients. I believe these are, in this picture, there are some incarcerated fellows doing some work there on the island. Recently, it became a park. So if you'd like to go visit Hart Island, you can arrange that, I guess, which is pretty interesting. It's just this island in the middle of the river. You can see the city in the background that has a whole lot of history to it. So the ambulances themselves utilized a drop harness for the horses for a speedy response. So, they'd be in these houses kind of waiting for a call, kind of like bunks, but you had to have your horse ready to go. But, you can't keep them, harnessed up to this thing all the time. So they are actually just kind of waiting to be deployed. So I have a real quick video here. It shows, I don't believe there's any audio, but these are fire apparatus, but it's still the same idea. You can see, so using the fire alarm box, and this is the quick hitch harness. So yeah, these things would be deployed from the ceiling and put around these horses, and people would jump on and then they would take off. And then there they would go. So that was them trying to leave the station. Into the 1870s, there was a major riot between Irish Catholics and Protestants. It's called the Elm Park Orange Riots. The ambulance was credited in saving many lives and receiving lots of good press. Really, that was used as a springboard for people demanding more ambulances. So there's these huge riots, there's these fights going on, and the ambulances went back and forth all day long, transporting all these injured people. So it was a very, very public thing, and people were able to see the ambulance and see that they were actually saving people. So after that, there was more of a public outcry to get more ambulances on the road. By 1878, there's many ambulance services in New York. These services were privately funded. This does not mean that the patients needing services were well off. To quote, one rarely sees a well-dressed occupant being carried to the hospital by the ambulance. It were better for a man to be placed on a dunghill or a stable than to let him remain in a house of charity. So basically, the only people who went to the hospital were those who had nowhere else to go and could not afford a house call from a physician. So really, one of the last places you want to be is in these hospitals. If you're well enough off and you can afford a physician to come visit you and treat you in your house, that is the ideal thing. But if you're if you're just a regular person or laborer kind of walking around the city, or you're getting injured on the job, or somebody stabs you in the street, the ambulance is going to come get you. And these are just some pictures of Bellevue in New York. You can kind of see just patients lined the hallways, just really trying to fit people in wherever they can. And then it wasn't long where funeral homes began to enter the ambulance service. And really, there's no standard for staffing. There's no regulations. There's no licensure. So some were trained in first aid. Others were not. Basically, whatever worked in moving the patients. So to quote, often ambulance drivers were hired solely on their basis or their ability to drive a horse at sufficient speed to get to the accident scene first and to secure the fare, while the attendant in the back was frequently nothing more than an idler who had been simply loafing around the barn, who finds delight in making runs. So, and at the same time, the ambulance is not catching on in Europe like it is in the United States. So the missing European ambulance, what they did have was called the night medical service. This was up to police stations, and they would keep a list of physicians willing to make house calls for a predetermined amount of money. The goal was to help treat people before they reached the terminal crisis point. So this was being used in London and Berlin, Paris, even in Russia, Poland, Rome. Really, that was the standard in Europe at the time. There were attempts to bring the American ambulance model to Europe, but it was not received well. for probably a variety of reasons. You know, I think that they had a good thing, or at least they perceived which was a good thing in the system, and physicians making money, making house calls. So when you have an established system like that, you don't want people just coming and picking up your patients and taking them to the hospital. What Great Britain did have was called the Knights of Malta, the British Order, which was the remnants of these Middle Eastern Crusaders that were still in England at the time. So in the 1870s, they started having these hand ambulances to help with mining and industrial accidents, and really transformed into this medical National Guard. By the 1880s, there's all these courses being taught, with certificates being issued. Basically, you could get a certificate after 7.5 hours of instruction. Once again, there's still concerns from doctors that the ambulance program is delivering more people to the hospital, interfering with their traditional treat-at-home practice. And that's just a picture I found of them. I guess they're moving patients any way they could. So, and this would become the St. John ambulance, which is still around today. It's kind of a British version of the Red Cross, but with a little more in depth, a little more actual setup, and how to say this. Sorry, it's like the Red Cross, but they actually go out and move people and do things like that. It's just not an accreditation type of service. This once again, this is Harper's Hospital in Detroit, Michigan. They had put a few shots in here just because I thought it was a beautiful building. It was demolished in the 1970s. It was designed by the same architect who had designed our Capitol building here in Michigan. There's some shots of the ambulance out in front of it. So when I was doing this, I was trying to find some firsthand accounts, from Michigan, from Detroit, of these early ambulance drivers, and I really wasn't able to find much. Really, just a lot of a general overview. The one person I did find, though, was named Dr. Joseph Ferguson. So while he was not an ambulance driver, he's very interesting. They probably would not have let him be an ambulance driver because of his color. But he was born to free parents around 1821. He took up barbering in Richmond, Virginia. Barbers did many medical tasks such as cupping and leeching. He decided to get a formal education in Pittsburgh with his wife and 2 children. He apprenticed with a white doctor. He moved to Ohio to go to medical school. Without a degree, he moved to Detroit and began medical practices. So, and at that time, like a lot of places, is very segregated. So really there's black hospitals versus white hospitals. So, being a black man serving a black community, he doesn't need a license. He did become a conductor of the Underground Railroad. He met with Frederick Douglass at his home. He helped integrate the Detroit public schools, and he continued to practice medicine during the Civil War. In 1863, there was a race riot in Detroit, and he entered the area to administer first aid and help people find shelter. In 1868, Civil War veterans launched the Detroit Medical College, and Ferguson applied and was admitted to the first class, which he graduated. Even though he didn't need this degree to practice medicine, he wanted to follow through and do that. So, like I said, unfortunately, he's not able to serve in regular hospitals or along with white people, but very, very influential person in Detroit history. In Harper Hospital, so they would treat African Americans, but they would not have a treating physician themselves until 1960. One other interesting person I came across was Dr. Emily Dunning Behringer. So she was the first female ambulance surgeon in New York. She finished med school in 1901. She placed first on her admissions exam for an internship at Governor Hospital, but was refused admission. She was awarded an internship in 1903 when there was a new mayor elected. The press was tipped off and accompanied her on her first runs, which was very scandalous at the time. She served a 2-year mentorship. She would later write a memoir of her life, and life of her movie would be made. So I'll try to show you a clip of the movie real quick. I think we're getting close on time, so I'm going to try and get through this real fast. I apologize if I'm talking over the audio. So I hear the movie's not very good, but once again, it's a great illustration of this drop harness on this horse. So this ambulance driver is getting it around. He's talking to her, telling her get in there. Like I said, I don't think the movie's very good, but when they leave here, it's a great illustration of what it would have been like on these horse-drawn ambulances here. So yeah, I mean, this movie's like from the 40s or 50s or whatever, but I think they did a really good job of recreating this scene here. So yeah, you got this horse flying down the road. He's ringing his bell with his foot. He's flying around here, probably trying not to hit any kids playing in the streets. Anyways, I thought it was pretty interesting in there. So, and then there, yeah, he's hitting the bell with his foot. Like I said, she did have a book. This book is out of print. It's very hard to find, very expensive. I'm sure it'd be a very interesting read. I'm going to try to blow through some of these last slides so we have time for some questions. Here's just a picture of a veterinarian ambulance from Detroit. So you had a lot of horses, a lot of other animals out in the streets. They also needed emergency response. You can't leave them laying. Oh, sorry. Can't leave them just laying there. So in 1899, the first electric ambulance is in Chicago. So some of the cons to an electric ambulance, it's more expensive than a horse carriage. It's about $2,500 to $4,000 compared to $1,200 for horse and carriage. You had to charge it between use. There's maintenance costs, there's insurance. It's a time to fix and repair the parts. Some of the pros: smoother ride, it's faster, shorter stopping distance, remove the nuisance of stables and horses and upkeep like that. Here's just some articles recently in the past year about electric ambulances, which I found interesting. You know, that now we're at the beginning when ambulances first started making on the scene. There's talk of trying to go electric, and you know that didn't really happen. And now we're back to probably at some point going back to electric vehicles. Sometimes streetcars were used, anything you could. So I believe this was in St. Louis. So they'd actually have this like ambulance streetcar. So people would get loaded up and they could work on them on the way to the hospital. The first motorized ambulance was technically this thing called the Paul Lisner ambulance in 1904. It was a Canadian-built tank based on a three-wheel tractor design. It could haul a wagon with up to 30 people and supplies. It was impenetrable against rifle fire. No orders were made to actually put this into production, even though it may have been very useful a few years later during the World War. And now we have the Cunningham ambulance. This was the first mass-produced automobile based in the United States. It was in 1909 by the James Cunningham Son and Company. So it was a 4-cylinder engine with 32 horsepower. The chassis rode on pneumatic tires, while the body featured electric lights, a suspended cot with 2 attendant seats, and a side-mounted gong. So at this point, we've come to a point of transition, not just for the ambulance, but the world in general. So everything's moving away from these horse-drawn everything, and we're getting electric vehicles and we're getting motorized vehicles. So the old horse-powered world is transitioning to a mechanical one. And then the Great War would come, and it would change everything. And at this point, this is kind of the end of part one, and I have to say to be continued. So that's kind of the history of the ambulance up until World War One. So that's all I have for you at this point. Yeah, thank you for letting me share that.
Of course, thank you so much, Derek. Anybody, if you have any questions, this is a great time to ask those. You can put those in the Q&A in the chat, and I can read them out here. I will also put the link in the chat right now to obtain your CEU. Lots of compliments, Derek.
Thank you.
Terry, yes, we did ask Derek to come back for part 2. So once that's wrapped up, we will definitely have him back on to present. Last call for questions. Derek, somebody asked if you were able to share the slides.
I can, if somebody wants to email me, I can.
Okay.
It's tough for me from my state email to send things that big, but I can figure something out.
Okay, yeah. In that case, I will put your contact information in the email that everyone will receive tomorrow, and then they can just reach out to you.
Sure.
Oh, a lot more compliments. I love history, and I had no idea about all of this. James, we're glad you joined us. All right, well, in that case, I suppose we'll wrap it up then, but if anybody has any questions at any other point in time, you will have Derek's email, so you can reach out directly to him. And I think that concludes our presentation today. So again, thank you so much, Derek, for being here. We greatly appreciate it, and we look forward to part 2.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
All right, have a good day, everyone. Bye.